Thank you, everybody. It's really great to be back after all these months and great to see everybody. This is such an amazing crowd, and it's just great to see all of you. Thanks so much, everybody. And I want to say that, Warren, that was just an amazing speech. I was moved by it. It was very powerful. It's fantastic, man. It's fantastic. But now I want to talk a little bit about the concept of democracy. So this is going to be good, right? Since the war in Ukraine broke out about 2 months ago, Americans have been treated to yet another round of self-congratulatory rhetoric from politicians and talking heads about the noble mission of the United States and its NATO puppets to promote and support so-called democracy around the world. This time specifically talking in reference to democracy in the Ukraine. We hear this word democracy used rhetorically in American foreign policy circles so much that we never really stop to think about what it means or how it's applied. The idea that America itself is a democracy simply goes unquestioned in popular media and by public intellectuals. But as Warren's speech illustrates, there are good arguments against that, to say the least. The idea that the foreign adversaries of the governing elite of the United States are inherently undemocratic, authoritarians, dictators, or some other such label, likewise goes unquestioned. This talk is accompanied by the assumption that the United States has some kind of historical mission to spread and defend liberal democracy around the world. This is worth examining for a second. What is this so-called democracy, and what does it mean to spread it? Do the U.S. government and the class of people that control its foreign policy have the moral authority to grant themselves the right to spread democracy to others? Do the people living in the countries targeted for this democratization get a say in whether or not they get this special treatment? No! And do the American people, particularly white people, who are tasked with fighting and dying in the inevitable wars created by the foreign policy establishment, do we get a say? No! No, we don't. In 2013, President Obama was considering intervening in the Syrian civil war, another conflict instigated by United States covert operations, to protect ISIS and other Islamic terrorist groups when they were about to be defeated by the legitimate government of Bashar Assad. These forces had disguised themselves as the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was a name so ham-fisted that it was hard to believe they were seriously calling themselves that. American public opinion was strongly against this move. The international disgrace that the Iraq War had become and the grueling occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan had led Americans to be tired of endless conflicts, particularly in the Middle East. This led to a flurry of articles from neoconservative commentators in the press decrying the American tendency towards what they called isolationism. This was a threat to democracy, they say. American isolationism was a threat to democracy. Jewish former Senator Joseph Lieberman penned a fairly typical editorial in the Washington Post 9 years ago this month, in April of 2013, saying, after World War I, disillusionment, this is a quote, after World War I, disillusionment with war and then the Great Depression brought a widely popular U.S. retreat from internationalism, economic as well as political. But the attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated that the United States could not avoid the responsibility of engagement with the world in the cause of freedom and democracy. This is a fairly typical statement from a neoconservative, a Jewish neoconservative, in attacking the American people for not wanting to fight war on behalf of Jewish interests. The suggestion that failure to intervene in Syria would lead to another Pearl Harbor is laughable, to say the least. But who in the mainstream was there to call out this blood-curdling nonsense? Nobody. Nobody. No one. A scan of the mainstream press from that time reveals that there were far more editorials from neoconservative pundits complaining about the tendency of the American people towards isolationism than there were any actual editorials opposing the intervention. So where is popular opinion on these issues represented in the press or among policymakers? Nowhere at all. And this is the democracy that is fighting for democracy. Public opinion, as always, is seen by these people as nothing more than an obstacle to their desired policy. On the topic of democracy, in 2014, two Princeton University professors named Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page wrote a paper in which they discovered that the median voter in the United States has a near zero chance of having their will enacted by government policy, should that opinion differ from those of wealthy elites. The authors studied 1,800 issues and claimed that when the views of ordinary people differed from those of the rich and powerful, it was obviously the rich who got their way every time. Now, several years later, in 2018, Vox, the online blog founded by Jewish journalists Ezra Klein and Matthew Iglesias, ran an article very critical of this paper. Some may remember Klein as the organizer of what is now the infamous Journo List, which was a Google forum exclusively for collaboration among Jewish and far-left bloggers, where members conspired with each other to frame the news according to their political views and plotted to smear their opponents. The Vox piece accused Page and Gillens of shoddy scholarship. According to Vox, the two authors were wrong. Ordinary people and the rich don't actually differ on their policy views. To be clear, though, one thing to be clear, Page and Gillens' paper was somewhat flawed. They focused far more on the opinions of rich individuals and certain big businesses, and left out the role of powerful NGOs in not only shaping policy, but in controlling both sides of acceptable debate. While this shortcoming was brought to the fore by the critics, those same critics never examined whether this phenomena itself, that of the power of NGOs, was democratic, or whether, if the power of NGOs in prescribing the parameters of debate possibly could lead to some of this so-called agreement between the rich and the middle class. That idea was never even thought about. So Page and Gillens' paper was sort of a relic. It was kind of an older style of liberalism, one that at least used to try to pretend to care about the opinions of the working man and the ordinary citizen. But in 2018, Vox and Klein and Iglesias and other Jews, they had no use for this kind of thing. They had no patience for quaint political notions such as the will of the people or the right of people to criticize the influence of the wealthy and the powerful. As Iglesias put it in the article criticizing the paper, quote, "The idea that the point of democracy is to implement legislative outcomes that are supported by broad-based surveys seems almost like a straw man dreamed up by an 18th century monarchist." So this raises the question, what exactly is the point of democracy? What is the point? The answer seems to lie in the basic assumptions behind the criticism of Page and Gillen and the fundamental conception that the current ruling elites have about democracy that they so often promote. In another paper titled, "The Majoritarian Threat to Liberal Democracy," published in 2021, University of Pennsylvania professor Guy Grossman, Guy Grossman suggested that majoritarianism, as he calls it, is fundamentally antithetical to democracy. The risk, according to Grossman, is the idea held by most people in the country have this idea, that elected officials ought to actually be able to govern and make rules for the people to follow. Even worse, he says, people tend to think this way, even if these elected officials threaten so-called democratic institutions. So Grossman says, we focus on an overlooked type, majoritarians, those who grant tremendous license to popularly elected incumbents. Power grabs do not violate what majoritarians hold as the preeminent democratic principle, that candidates elected by the majority should rule, even if that ends up undermining so-called democratic institutions. That's a word we hear a lot coming out of Washington and elite policy circles these days. Democratic institutions. You've all heard people talking like this, I'm sure. Another phrase they use is civil society. Both of these phrases are simply euphemisms for the constellation of Jewish powerful interests, NGOs and others, lobbying groups, etc., which is why people like Klein and Iglesias simply have no more patience for these antiquated notions of democracy as popular rule. No, democracy is ruled by these institutions which are tasked with guarding it. This emerging political consensus among the ruling establishment is that these democratic institutions, civil society groups, are the guardians of democracy. The people don't really need to be so much involved in this. Really, the role of the people is to sort of grant a veneer of legitimacy to the institutional consensus through formulaic and essentially meaningless elections every few years. So given all this, it's clear that looking into the idea of what democracy means in terms of a literal definition of the term is pointless for understanding the present circumstance that we live in. Whatever system rules in America will just be called democracy. The more interesting and honest question is, how does America actually function? Who actually makes the rules? And more importantly, who gets to break the rules? The current ruling enterprise that controls both the United States and Europe encompasses not just politics, but big business, media, academia, and non-governmental organizations. These are the democratic institutions that work together to perpetuate their rule and operate on the basis of certain core assumptions that are fundamentally at odds with what the average white American or the average white European person really thinks politically. In America, free speech is one of our most sacred institutions. It is supported by the overwhelming majority of the population, and it's considered our birthright as Americans. Every citizen born to this country has the fundamental right, the God-given right, to speak their mind in the public square on political issues. This is something we hold sacred. But they certainly don't. They certainly don't. Before the advent of the internet, it was fairly common to hear public figures exchange platitudes about support for the idea of free speech. But once the average citizen actually acquired the means to fairly easily and low-cost way possibly express their ideas to thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands or millions of their countrymen, this idea quickly changed amongst the elites. Suddenly, institutional support for free speech crumbled, replaced by an idea of responsible moderation. Responsible moderation. Powerful NGOs, like the Anti-Defamation League, now get to decide what Americans can and can't say online. The billionaire Elon Musk, his recent bid to buy Twitter, gives us a little bit of an idea of how this style of American so-called democracy actually works. Musk claimed to be fed up with censorship on Twitter, and he threatened a hostile buyout of the company. Over $40 billion was what he offered, promising that he would restore it as a free speech platform. Now, whether Musk was trolling or whether he was serious, it doesn't really matter. The incident shows us exactly the kind of reaction we can expect from the ruling class to the idea of people being allowed to actually freely share their ideas. What would it take to actually pull back a sliver of free speech for American citizens and people around the world online? More than $40 billion, apparently. That's quite not enough. If Musk is to persist in this quest to take control of Twitter, there can be no doubt that he will be subjected to speculative attacks on his stock holdings by Jewish financiers, frivolous lawsuits against his business interests by Jewish lawyers and legal groups, and by investigations into every single relationship and financial transaction he has ever engaged in by the FBI. And he's a billionaire. He's got billions of dollars, and this is what he's going to get, simply for making the attempt. Hostility to free speech is significantly linked to the threat laid out before by Joseph Lieberman and other Jews to isolationism, the threat of isolationism to their policy. This is one of the main things why they oppose the idea of free speech. To give just one example of this, a panicked reaction to Musk came from the arch neoconservative and famous Jewish warmonger, Max Boot, who said on Twitter, which now acts as the de facto public square, that Twitter needs more censorship, not less. Boot called for responsible moderation to protect free speech from the opinions of extremists. In other words, ordinary people like the people here in this room. So, just as these democratic institutions exist to protect democracy from voters, responsible moderation is needed to protect free speech from extremists. It's a similar ideology behind both terms. Boot needs protection from criticism by the general public because his views just aren't popular and he can't actually make the argument. He needs to be free. No opposition to his point of view can be allowed because otherwise it's revealed for nothing more than crass warmongering, as it has always been. But if history is any guide, the danger lies not in free speech, but in allowing the Jewish foreign policy establishment to have free reign over the narrative. That's the real danger. The same people, the very same people calling for responsible moderation now have been screeching for war for the last 30 years. First in Iraq, then in Serbia, then in Afghanistan, then in Iraq again, in Syria, in Libya, Yemen, Iran, and now, of course, in Ukraine. What is democratic about any of this? When was the last time the government even pretended to consult the people on these matters? Never. In 2003, during the preparation for the invasion and occupation of Iraq, politicians, lobbying groups, and the media collaborated to sell the American people on a phony story about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. A story that every single person on planet Earth knew was bullshit. Every single person. This included the pundits on CNN and Fox News who spent 24 hours a day pumping out hysterical propaganda, claiming that Saddam Hussein could launch a nuclear strike on London at any moment. Does anyone remember this? The so-called sexed up dossier, remember that? Anyone? No one? There's probably some people old enough to remember the sexed up dossier. One of the worst offenders was Jewish talking head Wolf Blitzer, who who renamed his nightly news program Showdown Iraq for several months in order to spew nothing but neoconservative vomit all over the television screens of the nation. Not only does this show how weak their case was, it shows their utter contempt for the American people. The sheer hypocrisy of the United States that we're seeing right now in lecturing others about peace, stability, national sovereignty is so immense, it's so mind-blowing, it's almost impossible to express it in words. The United States and the NATO puppet states that follow behind it have been the main aggressors, the main source of international conflict and instability, and the biggest roadblocks to peace negotiations since at least the 1990s, when the Soviet Union ceased to be an obstacle. In 1991, the United States subjected the state of Iraq to one of the heaviest aerial bombardment campaigns in history. For 42 days, the U.S. conducted 100,000 bombing sorties over Iraq and dropped 88,000 tons of munitions on the country. 92% of all electrical generation capacity in the country was destroyed. 80% of oil production was destroyed. Roads, bridges, telephone lines, industrial plants were all destroyed. All of this justified by Saddam Hussein's border dispute with the tiny little state of Kuwait, which is so unimportant on a world scale, it may as well not exist. Even when the Iraqi surrender and withdrawal from Kuwait was a fait accompli, the bombardment continued with an incident today known as the Highway of Death, in which thousands of retreating Iraqi military vehicles were repeatedly bombed from the air, leaving a 60-mile trail of wreckage and dead bodies across the main highway from Kuwait to Iraq. In subsequent years, the consequences of the rapid destruction of Iraq and its inability to recover from this devastation due to economic sanctions had catastrophic results, including poverty, malnutrition, and infant mortality. This is a price that the Jewish Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, famously said was worth it when she was confronted by an angry group of students. So what was it that was worth it? Was it really about a border dispute over an oil field between Saddam Hussein and Kuwait? No. It was really because after 8 years of war with Iran, in which Saddam Hussein's military was funded and armed by the United States to the tune of billions of dollars in order to fight the Iranians, he had amassed the fourth largest military in the world. This military, sitting so close to the state of Israel, was an intolerable threat, and any excuse was needed to simply destroy it. That's what this was about. In 2003, after a decade of sanctions, weapons inspections meant to deprive Iraq of an economy and any ability to resist, the U.S. finally invaded the country to complete the process of democracy. The country had not yet recovered from the devastation of 1991 and quickly fell after only a month of bombing and fighting, again targeting vital infrastructure. Now, this invasion of Iraq had long been planned by Jewish neoconservative intellectuals in a very typical democratic fashion, meaning far outside the scope and knowledge of the United States public. In 1996, Jewish warmonger Richard Pearl and the Middle East policy advisor for President George W. Bush, David Wurmser, co-authored a paper for a group called the Institute for Advanced Strategic Studies in Israel. The paper was titled "A Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm." Now, the realm here being Israel, okay, not America, not America. The paper recommended using the United States military as a battering ram against those states that were still belligerent against the state of Israel. In one famous passage, the authors say, Israel can shape its strategic environment in cooperation with Turkey and Jordan by weakening, containing, and even rolling back Syria. That means regime change or getting rid of the government. This effort can focus on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, an important Israeli strategic objective in its own right, as a means of foiling Syria's regional ambitions. Coincidentally, this is, I'm sure, just a total coincidence, 1 year later, the Jewish lobbying group Project for a New American Century, also headed by Richard Pearl, was founded in America, promoting the exact same agenda as listed in the Clean Break memo from the Israeli think tank. I'm sure that all that is just a coincidence, though. Now, Joe Lieberman was well aware of this in 2013 when he castigated the American public for not wanting to continue this Jewish war aim. He was well aware of it. This had nothing to do with promoting democracy, and Joseph Lieberman knew it. As did every other Jewish neoconservative that promoted the same policy. Every single one of them. They all knew it was a lie. And another result, probably that hits close to home for many of us here, another result of the war in Iraq and the civil war in Syria was the huge refugee crisis in Europe, which started in 2015. Against the will of the European people, the governments of Germany and other major European states decided to open their doors to millions of migrants. Initially, they were claimed to be from Syria, but eventually they were from Africa and any part of the Middle East, and really anywhere that people weren't white. The welcoming of such refugees became a core part of the policy of the European Union, and even a core part of its fundamental identity, according to new rules that the European Union itself imposed without any input from the European people. The European people were never given a single opportunity to vote on this issue. Now, helping to assist these European states with the importation and settlement of these refugees that the Europeans never asked for was the Israeli Refugee Resettlement Agency, Israel, who operated all refugee welcome centers on the Greek island of Lesbos and on the southern coast of Italy. In 2011, the United States orchestrated the removal of Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi. People may remember Hillary Clinton in her famous news appearance saying, "We came, we saw, he died," in a rather psychotic expression of her glee at the murder of the Libyan president. Gaddafi had long-standing agreements with several European states that would keep refugees from Africa off European shores. Obviously, with his death, those agreements are now moot, and Libya plunged into a state of chaos. Gaddafi himself once said in 2010 that without him, Europe would turn black, and he was right. Another little understood war for democracy was the 1999 NATO bombing campaign against the nation of Serbia. In this case, the US and NATO intervened in a regional conflict that was of no concern and not well understood by Americans and by many Europeans. Now, by neoconservative standards, this is one of the most democratic wars ever, because the American people had no idea where it was, what it was about, and who was involved. The average American literally had no clue about this conflict, and the news media didn't really help in making it clear. In this case, what it was a civil war between ethnic Albanians and Serbs in the small Serbian province of Kosovo. The excuse was the supposed genocide of Albanians by Serb forces, a claim for which no subsequent evidence has ever been produced. Does that sound familiar? In this effort to weaken Serbia, the United States and the NATO puppets backed an Albanian terrorist organization known as the Kosovo Liberation Army. The KLA was a viciously anti-Serbian and wanted to break Kosovo away from Serbia and rule it as its own small fiefdom. In pursuit of this democratic goal, the NATO powers bombed Serbia for 78 days. 1,000 aircraft were involved in 38,000 bombing runs over the territory, resulting in thousands of Serbian and Albanian deaths and over $30 billion in damage, which is a devastating amount for a poor country. The United States even bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade because the Chinese had voted against them in the Security Council at the United Nations. Writing in the New York Times, the Jewish foreign policy analyst Thomas Friedman, a big supporter of liberal democracy. I mean, you should read this guy's columns. He's huge into liberal democracy. He loves it. He said this about the bombing. If NATO's only strength is that it can bomb forever, then it has to get every ounce out of that. Let's at least have a real air war. The idea that people are still holding rock concerts in Belgrade or going out for Sunday merry-go-round rides while their fellow Serbs are cleansing Kosovo is outrageous. It should be lights out in Belgrade. Every power grid, water pipe, bridge, road, and war-related factory has to be targeted. Like it or not, we are at war with the Serbian nation. The Serbs certainly think so, and the stakes have to be very clear. Every week you ravage Kosovo is another decade we will set your country back by pulverizing you. You want 1950, we can do 1950. You want 1389, we can do 1389 too. If we can frame the issue that way, Mr. Milosevic will blink. Now this is written by a smarmy, short, chubby little Jew from a Manhattan office talking about pulverizing an entire country, an entire nation, because the Jewish view of war is not one that separates combatants and civilians. It's not one that separates governments and people. These distinctions are not recognized. When Jews go to war, or when they have us go to war for them, it's a war against an entire people. That's how they view it. That's how they view it. This is why we see Palestinians who dare to resist the Israeli occupation have their families' homes targeted for demolition. This is why David Goldhagen wrote his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, blaming the entire German people for the Holocaust hoax because they supposedly sat idly by and probably went out for Sunday afternoon gatherings while supposedly Jews were being gassed. This is their view on how warfare works. Entire nations and peoples are targeted. This is why it is so dangerous for these people to control our government and our foreign policy. At the urging of the Russians, after the 78-day bombing campaign, the Serbians surrendered and withdrew their forces from Kosovo. The result was the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Serbs from the territory of Kosovo. The same U.S. government that tells white Americans that we have to live in a state with people of every race and color, and that any conflict that results from this arrangement is our own fault because of our racism, waged a war based on the premise that Serbs and Albanians could not live together in one province of Serbia. And today, these same people are beating the war drums again, this time for what would be a catastrophic war against Russia. Whatever your opinion on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, two things are clear about this conflict. One, it needs to be stopped as soon as possible. And two, under no circumstances can the Jewish neoconservatives and warmongers that run United States foreign policy, people like Max Boot, Joseph Lieberman, Thomas Friedman, and their ilk, under no circumstances can they be allowed to drag us into war against Russia. Under no circumstances. Over the last 2 months, we have seen America and the NATO puppets do everything they can to draw this conflict out, to prolong the death and suffering, to pump Ukraine full of weapons, and to encourage Ukrainian civilians to engage in kamikaze attacks against Russian tanks. American media and political pundits are more than willing to fight this war to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. Meanwhile, the economic sanctions imposed on Russia have really hit us here at home. They've hit the pockets of white Americans who never asked for any of this. 10% inflation and potentially catastrophic economic collapse in Europe, as right now Germany, which is dependent on gas imports from Russia, is being told to cut it off, which would lead to a rapid collapse of German industry. Possibly hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Germans would lose their jobs, and the economy would go into complete shock. But this is worth it for the Jews and the neocons that run foreign policy, that run NATO, and have long targeted Russia for breakup and destruction. It's worth it to them. But we and the Germans and none of the civilians of Europe were ever asked what we thought about this. Was what we think about this idea of destroying Russia as the fundamental goal of our country. What business is that of ours? The recent election in Hungary, which were won in part on the basis of a promise to keep Hungary out of the conflict, have resulted in sanctions against Hungary in the name of democracy. And another thing happened in that Hungarian election. The Hungarians put a referendum before the people on whether or not they thought that children should be exposed to homosexual and transgender propaganda in schools and in the media. And they overwhelmingly voted no, once again placing themselves in the undemocratic camp. When was the last time the American people were allowed to vote up and down, no or yes, on a simple matter of policy like that? No, every institution in this country is meant to obfuscate our ability to influence this country at all, to influence policy. The whole thing is to make it opaque, impossible to see through and impossible to access for us, leaving us no option but what we're doing right now. Popular will. It's the only thing that mobilized can stop this. The madness of the current system has to stop. We cannot trust that the people running this out-of-control system will ever come to their senses and stop it themselves, so the task falls to us, white Americans, who are the target of this evil system's racial policies at home and have for too long served as the cannon fodder for its wars abroad. This country was stolen from us in the name of democracy, which in reality is simply the dictatorship of powerful Jewish interest groups. They want to suck this country dry of its resources and use it as a military base for their individual goal of world conquest. It's now our task to hold them accountable, to fight for a state. It's our task to fight for a state that acts in our interests and represents our people and protects our right. It seems like a massive fight, like a huge uphill battle, and it is. It's not going to be easy, but as this current crisis shows, we simply have no other choice. Thank you.